My name is Michael Fakhri. I am the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food. What that means is I'm the leading UN independent expert on all matters regarding hunger, famine, and malnutrition. Another way to think about the job is I'm the eyes, ears, and sometimes good conscience for the UN on all matters regarding the right to food. So I'm independent. It's a volunteer job. They don't pay me. And my job is to report to the UN. So also what I do is I talk to everybody. I talk to diplomats, I talk to world leaders, ministers, activists, peasants, workers, just everybody, because it's about food and I can talk about it with anyone. And I learn from everyone. And my job is to share what I learn with everyone about how food is made, how it's distributed, how it's eaten, and how can we make our food systems more fair, and to make sure that people aren't going hungry, that there isn't malnutrition, and that there isn't starvation in the world. Those are the rules they created for themselves. So this is a system created by governments about holding each other accountable. And what they want from special rapporteurs, and we're called mandate holders, we hold these mandates, is to be the independent voices, to say what can't be said. So we provide that, we bring a larger space of freedom to discuss these issues, human rights issues, into the UN, which diplomats might not be able to talk about, but they want to. So we're able to push that agenda in a way that allows governments to advance things that they might not be able to start themselves. So my background is in international law, and I focused on all things having to do with food and agriculture. So I was looking at it from the perspective of trade, development, investment, land rights, and of course, from a human rights perspective. So in focusing on food and agriculture, I was doing a lot of my early work in 2008, 2009. And there was a global food crisis at the time. The price of food skyrocketed all over the world, and it triggered riots. So political systems were at stake. People were rioting in the streets, demanding their governments do something about the rise of food prices and the rise of hunger. And I saw that one of the major players and more independent voices talking about the food crisis was the Special Rapporteur on the right to food. And I thought, what an interesting position. Like, this is someone in the UN system that's not the UN, and they get to analyze what's going on and speak publicly about what are the problems and what needs to be done. And so I thought, well, what an interesting job. And I asked around, and people said, yeah, you just apply for it. I literally filled out a form online, hit send, and it goes to the Human Rights Council, and they interview you, and then they vote. So you compete amongst experts from all over the world. And admittedly, I was a little surprised that I got it because I don't have any connections in Geneva. I'm an outsider to the UN system. I didn't really have any direct contacts. I just filled out a form and hit send. And so my mandate started on May 2020. Which was an interesting time to start, considering March 2020 was when most of the world was in a lockdown because of the pandemic. So the first thing to always understand about hunger is always a political problem. So for at least the last 60 years, if not the last 100 years, any case of hunger has not been because there isn't enough food available. We've had more than enough food being produced for people around the world. Whenever there's hunger, it's a political breakdown. It means someone is denying people access to food. It's always a political choice, and it's always by design, and it's always intentional. So hunger is first and foremost a political problem, not a supply problem and not a availability problem. And we see this throughout history. So whenever there's been hunger, it's been a breakdown of institutions. In its more vicious form, starvation. Throughout history, food has always been used as a weapon. And some of the great examples are the so-called Great Famine in Ireland. Well, to call it a famine is a misnomer. Famine implies that it's some sort of passive natural phenomenon. It was the British Empire starving the Irish at the time. Just like the Great Famine of Bengal was also the result of the British Empire making choices. Famines, there's Stalin's starvation campaign against the Ukrainians. There's German campaigns in Namibia. One could go on and on. It's often in colonial history. So starvation being used to weaken indigenous peoples, local peoples, to displace them, dispossess them from their land, or to control them, to have more control over the people. So it was a common tool as a weapon against colonized people. It was a common tool for opponents to use it against each other in war. And we continue to see this in modern history after the Second World War. About 10, 15 years ago, many famine experts thought that we're not going to see as many famines anymore, that it's not going to be used as much. But the last 10 years, we've actually seen starvation being used more and more as a tactic. More and more countries, militias, armies are using starvation as a tactic, or are directly or indirectly supporting starvation. So what's interesting for me is, why is it so difficult to end starvation? It's because every major power in the world, every permanent member of the Security Council, either directly or indirectly supports a starvation campaign in the world. So those countries with power want to be able to use starvation as a tool of domination and control, and they're not willing to give that up, even if their enemies are using it. So most recently, in Azerbaijan, the Azerbaijani government used hunger as a way of ethnically cleansing Nagorno-Karabakh and pushing out the Armenians out of Nagorno-Karabakh. This was under the watch of the Russian government. This was under a peace treaty that the Russian government was monitoring and had peacekeepers. And the Russian government allowed the Azerbaijani government to use hunger to commit genocide against the Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh. This is just a few years ago. Meanwhile, we also see how the United States continues to actively, financially, militarily support Israel, which also most recently has been using starvation against the Palestinian people in Gaza, but also across all occupied Palestinian territories. So you have both the United States and Russia supporting starvation campaigns, and it's not like the United States and Russia get along, but what they both agree to is for allowing starvation to be used as a weapon of war. Every permanent member of the Security Council has either directly or indirectly supported starvation in the last 10 years. The most clear examples are those of Russia in Azerbaijan and the United States in Israel. But all the other members of the Security Council have done so indirectly, turned a blind eye, or financially supported a starvation campaign. Hamas attacked Israeli citizens and soldiers on October 7th, 2023. On October 6th, 2023, 50% of people in Gaza were food insecure and 80% depended on humanitarian aid. Israel had been imposing blockade against the Palestinians in Gaza since the year 2000. So 23-year blockade, making sure people were hungry. They were counting calories. Israel wanted to make sure every Palestinian in Gaza was hungry, but not hungry enough to raise alarm bells. That was October 6th. October 7th happened. On October 9th, Israel announced its starvation campaign publicly. It announced a total siege against all of Gaza in a situation that was already precarious. And they were using dehumanizing language, describing Palestinians as subhuman, as animals, of children of the night. That raised alarm bells, which is why myself, amongst other special rapporteurs, within weeks of Israel announcing its starvation campaign, raised the alarm of the risk of genocide. By the end of October, we saw the risk of genocide. By December, every single person in Gaza, 2.3 million people, were hungry. We had never seen so many civilians made to go hungry so quickly and so completely in modern history. So I think to understand why the Gaza Strip exists and why does it exist the way it does, we have to go not just to the creation of Israel, but before the creation of Israel. Under the Ottoman Empire, you had a territory, and it was Palestine. With the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the British government occupied Palestine. And what they decided to do is then to allow for Zionist settlements to come from Europe into Palestine. And so starting in the early 20th century, we saw more and more Zionist settlers from Europe come into Palestine. Now, Palestine at the time is a mix of different Christians, different Muslims, Jewish communities that have lived there for thousands of years. But the Zionist settlers were European settlers. And so the British proclaimed what's called the Balfour Declaration, basically identifying Palestine as a Jewish homeland. And so with the end of British occupation, they put the question to the UN, and the State of Israel is created in 1948. With the creation of the State of Israel, you immediately saw the dispossession of Palestinians from their land. They were pushed off of their land. And immediately it created a starvation crisis. So the UN recognized in 1949 that the millions of Palestinians that were now made refugees because the State of Israel pushed them off their land were at risk of starvation. So the State of Israel was using food as a weapon from the very beginning by disrupting farms, by pushing people off of their farmlands, by disrupting fishers' access to the sea, and by imposing Zionist settlers in their own food systems that excluded Palestinians. So since 1948, you have starvation as a problem, and then you have Palestinian territories. You had the West Bank, and you have the Gaza Strip. That was the remaining Palestinian territories. The West Bank was governed by Jordan, and the Gaza Strip was governed by Egypt, up until the 1967 war. In the 1967 war, Israel then ends up taking over those lands and occupying. So ever since 1967, Israel has occupied the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And ever since 1967, Israel has fragmented and dissociated all the different Palestinian lands in an attempt to disconnect Palestinians from each other and from their own homeland. And so the Gaza Strip is exactly that. It's a strip of land that's filled with families that are originally from Gaza, but from Palestinian refugees that have been displaced from their villages from all over 1948 Palestine. So Gaza is filled with people who've been displaced multiple times over multiple generations. Israel has maintained an incredible amount of control over the flow of goods and people of Gaza since 1991. And starting in 2000, they imposed a blockade. What that meant was they would really tighten and restrict the movement of people and goods, not allowing people to leave at times and not allowing certain goods to enter. And they made no rhyme or reason what was allowed in. So, for example, coriander was banned, chocolate was banned, wedding dresses were not allowed in, pasta was not allowed in until John Kerry pointed out to the Israeli government, how is pasta a security threat? And so Israel had this incredible amount of control to dominate and weaken the Palestinian people. Now, Israel used to occupy Gaza directly by having the presence of their military on the ground in Gaza and with settlers. That changed in 2005, 2006. Israel continued to occupy Gaza, but what they did is they pulled out their military and they formed a siege around Gaza. And that siege made it even worse. And that siege started in 2007. So ever since 2000, and it gets worse in 2007, Israel has maintained and controlled every aspect of daily life in Gaza. What color they're allowed to paint their mosques? What are they allowed to eat? What are they allowed to wear? How are they allowed to celebrate? So you have generations of Palestinians that have not been able to eat their normal food, their national dishes, the dishes that make them Palestinian, because they've been so limited in the ingredients that they can use. In the little everyday pleasures, sometimes they don't allow coffee in to Gaza. So the Israeli government micromanaged every aspect of daily life of every individual in Gaza. That's what the nature of the occupation is in Gaza. Netanyahu announced his intent in the United Nations in September 2023. He stood up at the General Assembly before every government of the world with a map of what he called Israel. And that map showed a full annexation of all Palestinian territories. From the minute that Israel was created until now, the Zionist project has been about pushing the Palestinians off of their land to allow for Zionist settlers to take over and have control over the land. The old Zionist slogan was, a land without people for a people without land, erasing the very existence of the Palestinians. And so it's been a slow process over the decades. What we saw in Gaza, and I'm going to add what we see in the West Bank, is an acceleration of these already existing processes. The Israeli legal regime is designed to dispossess Palestinians, to oppress Palestinians, and to push them off of their land. It's in their laws. So, for example, there's the law that declares Israeli a Jewish homeland. So it turns it into an ethno-nationalist state. There's the right of return for all Jewish people to Israel, but if you're Palestinian, you don't have a right of return under Israeli law. So everything in Israeli laws privileges Jewish people, and that's never defined who's Jewish in broad terms. And if you're Palestinian, the laws are designed to push you off of your land, very specifically. If you haven't been home because you're a refugee, that your land is treated as vacant, and then the Israeli government takes it over and then gives it to a new settler. And you see Palestinians who hold Israeli citizenship. They're second-class citizens under the Israeli legal regime. So in their laws, by design, they privilege all Jewish people in a broad way and treat Palestinians as less than human. You see it in the food system. So, for example, under Israeli law, Israeli military law is what governed the West Bank. And Israeli military laws would govern the Gaza Strip. And so under Israeli law, Palestinian farmers are not allowed to grow corn over a certain number of feet. The thinking being that if the corn is too high, it becomes a security threat. That means you can't really grow corn properly. You can't really feed your family. That weakens you. That gives you less incentive to become a farmer. What are you going to do? You're going to end up working somewhere, a laborer, and for cheap labor, or immigrating because you can't feed your family. So everything about Israeli law is really designed to privilege and prioritize Jewish identity over that of the Palestinians. It's baked into their legal system. Starting in 1991 is when Israel really starts restricting the movement of people and goods in Gaza, and their full-on siege begins in 2000. But at this whole time, what they're doing is they're just punishing the Palestinians of Gaza. I'm trying to understand why a government would do this, and there's nothing I can come to. The only conclusion I can come to is that Israel wanted to punish all the Palestinians, to push them off of that land, and to control them and to dominate them. Why Gaza? What's the wealth of Gaza? Gaza's the sea. And you have land, you have sea, you have natural gas. That's the other thing. I'm not sure when the natural gas was discovered there, but that's what's on the eye of Israel right now as we speak. They've been already trying to sell contracts of access to natural gas off of the territory of Gaza, which this is Palestinian Sea. So Israel already has its eye on Gaza as a source of natural resources, as real estate development, and as just the continued expansion of the state of Israel. So after the Palestinians elected Hamas as their government in Gaza, Israel decided to punish the Palestinians even more. And the way they did that is they imposed what's called the Gaza diet. So they'd already imposed a siege since 2000, but what they started doing in 2007 is counting calories. So they measured how many people live in Gaza, accounted for how many calories an adult male needs, adult female, child, elderly person, and then they regulated the number of calories. And I use the word calories, not food, just pure calories, fuel. And they would count the number of calories to ensure that people were just hungry enough to be weak, but not so hungry to raise international alarm bells. That was collective punishment of all the Palestinians for electing Hamas as a government. So if you are targeting civilians to harm them, that's a war crime. Israel decided to collectively punish every single person in Gaza for electing Hamas as a government. And if you're going to punish civilians, and you're going to target civilians, that's an international war crime. And that's what makes it more egregious is they're being punished for exercising their political right to vote for whomever they want. After Hamas was elected to govern Gaza, Israel deemed Gaza hostile territory. What that meant is they started treating it as a space filled with enemy combatants, and that all individuals were fair game in terms of targets. They started treating it as if it was a theater of war in another country. In reality and under international law, Israel was occupying Gaza, and it's an illegal occupation. You cannot occupy another country, especially for decades. And when you are an occupying power, you have certain duties to the civilians. So international law says Israel is occupying Gaza and is mistreating the Palestinians. And what Israel is saying is this is hostile territory, and 2.3 million Palestinians are all terrorists and are all fair targets for our military actions. That's the context of Gaza going into October 2023. So when Hamas attacks into Israel, it's responding to the occupation. What Hamas did do, however, was also kidnap civilians, which is also a war crime. So when Hamas attacked on October 7th, Israel almost instantaneously unleashed a genocidal campaign. It's not surprising they acted so swiftly because in September 2023, Benjamin Netanyahu stood before the United Nations and showed a map announcing Israel's intent to annex and take over all Palestinian territories. So this suggests that Israel was waiting for the right moment to implement this plan, whether it was going to be in October 2023 or some other time soon down the line. And the fact that they announced a full siege and a starvation campaign on October 9th, 2023, meant that they were ready. They were ready to starve the Palestinians. That's what happened in October. It's because Israel has been occupying Gaza and the West Bank and East Jerusalem since 1967 with no accountability and with no repercussions. So by being an occupying power then, Israel also decided to try and annex more and more land. So while it's occupying the West Bank, it's allowing for Israelis to go and settle, create settlements in the West Bank, which means Israel is encouraging Israeli citizens to push Palestinians off their land and to take over what remaining land they have in the West Bank and early on in Gaza. So it's not only an occupation, it's an occupation with a plan to annex and take over and fully have sovereignty over the West Bank and Gaza. That's always been the plan. And so in order to do that, Israel has always maintained a huge amount of control over every aspect of daily life in Gaza, down to the minutia of what you can eat and what you can paint and what you can do. That degree of control meant that it was almost like they flipped a switch and just sped up the process of hunger and turned it into starvation at a genocidal rate. So the way to think about what life in Gaza was like before October 7 is just looking at the rate of hunger. And 50% of people in Gaza were food insecure, and 80% relied on humanitarian aid. That meant that Gazans couldn't feed themselves, and when they couldn't feed themselves adequately. And we were seeing rates of malnutrition skyrocket in Gaza from the year 2000. Since the blockade began, we saw very high rates of malnutrition amongst children. So you have high rates of malnutrition, high rates of hunger, a dependency on humanitarian aid, the destruction of the food system in Gaza. This is all over the span of over 2 decades. So that's why it was so easy for Israel to starve the Palestinians in Gaza starting in October 2023. They built a very efficient killing, starving machine. That's what Israel did. By design, Israel created one of the most efficient killing machines against the Palestinians in Gaza and in the West Bank. And that was the food system. So before October 7, the average number of trucks that entered Gaza was about 500 trucks of humanitarian relief a day. And that was not enough to make sure people were healthy. 500 trucks a day was enough to keep people alive. That was it. And people depended on that humanitarian aid. If those 500 trucks did not come that day, people were going to start dying from hunger very quickly. That was before October 7th. Then on October 9th, Israel imposes a total siege. It doesn't allow a single truck in for 2 weeks. Then after that, it allows a few trucks in, but mostly in the south, but not into the north. Now, if we see a few trucks here and there, think about this. If we needed 500 trucks to keep people alive in Gaza before the war, we need an exponential amount more trucks just to keep people barely alive. There's been malnutrition, wasting away of children. People are sick. People are exhausted. The amount of disease that's going to kill people is going to exceed the number of people killed by bullets and bombs. So we need more than 500 trucks just to get people barely through what we see. The humanitarian relief that is necessary to ensure that the people in Gaza can live with some semblance of dignity is at a measure that we're all struggling to figure out how to count that. So we keep hearing record number of bombs have been dropped on Gaza, more than any modern war. Record number of humanitarian workers have been killed. Record number of UN workers have been killed. Record number of children are amputees. The list goes on in the record number of destruction. We keep inventing new words to describe death: genocide, domicide, scholasticide. We're running out of language, and we keep trying to describe all the death and destruction of Gaza. Now that there's a so-called ceasefire in Gaza, only now are we really going to understand the horrors and pain and suffering that the Palestinian people have experienced in Gaza because of Israel. So for me, the surest sign that there is starvation is when the first child dies from malnutrition. The reason is this: whenever you're hungry, whenever a community is experiencing hunger, the first thing any community does is we feed our children. You feed your children in your family, you feed your neighbor's children. When you're in a situation where you can no longer feed your child and you have to hold your child while they waste away in your arms, that's what tells you that your system is collapsed. Your entire social structure is collapsed when that first child dies. And so that's what we see in Gaza. That's what we see in Sudan. And the international community does nothing when that first child dies. Every single time they start to ask, oh, but is it famine? That's how do we know what's happening? The effects are profound. Starvation is always the result of slow death. It's a structural problem that takes time to create the conditions that allow for it to happen. When it happens, it's a shock. But then the implications last for generations. So not only does it affect your own body if you survive, it affects the genes that you transmit if you have children after you've been starved. But there's the social trauma. The social trauma of starvation lasts for generations because it carries with it a particular shame. And I learned this in talking to people from Ireland. When you survive starvation, that means you are someone who has made a choice on who you had to feed and who you couldn't feed. Your neighbor comes to you for a cup of rice and you have to turn them away. You have 15 children. Who do you feed first? You have 30 people in your home. Who eats first and who eats last? People who've survived famine and starvation have survived the moral weight of choosing who to feed and who not to feed, and they live with that shame. It's very difficult to talk about that shame in public, which is why we see so very few monuments or commemorations of these moments of great pain. We see it for great wars and other moments of history, but we rarely see public commemorations of starvation because it carries a particularly painful trauma, social trauma, that is hard to talk about in public. Starvation is one of the cruelest things we can do to each other because it's always intentional. It's always a choice. And it always has this long-term effect, and it's always slow and painful. On an individual basis, starvation is torture. On a broader scale, starvation is always going to result in either genocide or the elimination of a civilian population. It is one of the worst atrocities we commit against each other as humans. Starting on October 9th, Israel announced its intention to starve every single civilian in Gaza. Meanwhile, in the West Bank, there was record number of violence against Palestinians by Israeli settlers with the support of the Israeli government. All this is happening while the Israeli government uses dehumanizing language against the Palestinians, presenting Palestinians as less than human. Basically, Israel announced its intent to kill Palestinians simply because they're Palestinian. Israel announced its intent to either want to eliminate the Palestinians entirely from the land in whole or in part. And then they implemented their plan, and then they achieved the predictable goal, which is mass amounts of death, pain, and horror, with impunity. At this point, with the Palestinians also documenting the violence being done against them, this is probably the first genocide that's been documented so clearly in real time by the victims of genocide themselves. People have seen it for themselves over 15 months. At this point, the burden shifts to people. You explain to me it's not genocide. It's so straightforward and clear. Anyone who says that they have to wait for the International Court of Justice to decide whether or not it's genocide, they're avoiding the obvious, and they're avoiding the necessity and obligation of taking action. Under international law, where there's a risk of genocide, you don't even have to prove that there's actual genocide. There is an obligation to act to eliminate that risk of genocide. So there is an International Court of Justice ruling that says there's a plausible case of genocide. There was, and we can say in the most conservative way, a risk of genocide. So in the most basic terms, there's an international obligation to eliminate the risk of genocide. So in April 2024, we started seeing reports that Anthony Blinken received information from USAID and the State Department Refugee Agency that Israelis were denying US humanitarian aid from reaching Palestinians, and that there was probably a case of famine spreading across Gaza. Under US law, if there is evidence of the denial of US humanitarian aid, the United States is not allowed to continue sending financial and military support to that country that's denying humanitarian aid. The same is true if there are gross violations of human rights. And there was huge amounts of evidence coming from the UN, from different human rights organizations, and from within the US government that there were gross violations of human rights by Israeli forces against the Palestinians. Blinken and President Biden chose to ignore those reports and give Israel the benefit of the doubt in order to continue sending weapons and financial aid to Israel. The way Israel implemented its starvation campaign was in two ways. One was by attacking the humanitarian system, and it did this in a lot of ways. One, it would stop trucks from entering the border, or it'd slow them down so that the food in the truck would expire. Or it would allow trucks to get through the border, but then they would target those trucks and attack those trucks, destroying the humanitarian convoys. So even though those convoys would coordinate with Israeli forces would still target those humanitarian convoys. And then let's imagine the convoy gets through and civilians are actually getting access to humanitarian aid. There were reports of over 20 incidents of Israeli forces attacking civilians while they were getting humanitarian aid. The most well-known one was the so-called flour massacre, when civilians were rushing to a truck to get flour and Israeli forces opened fire, but that wasn't the only incident. So that's how Israel attacked humanitarian convoys, which is why humanitarian workers at times stopped going because they feared for their own life. So again, a record number of humanitarian workers were killed by Israel in Gaza, more so than any modern war in history. But the other way Israel imposed starvation and created famine in Gaza is by attacking the food system itself, denying Palestinians the ability to feed themselves. So they would use things like white phosphorus, which poisons the soil. They would target fishers and destroy their fishing boats, denying them access to the sea so they can't get fish to feed people. They would take over agricultural land and call it a buffer zone, denying farmers the ability to grow food. They were destroying orchards. They were destroying greenhouses. They basically destroyed over 80% of agricultural land in Gaza. So people in Gaza were no longer receiving humanitarian aid, nor were they able to feed themselves. They were left to forage for what wild grasses they could muster to use to eat, and sort of piece together what they can from what they could find. They had to be creative with what little food they had to share, but they were dying. they were dying from hunger. You know, during the time of Gaza, and even now, people talk about the day after. And what's never clear to me is the day after what now? The day after this war in Gaza, the day after genocide, the day after 70 years of occupation. So the day after, I think, is a term that's useless. I think the way to think about the future is to come back to the core question. How do we make sure that Israel no longer occupies Palestinian territory, but more fundamentally, which is not asked enough, which is in 1947 and 1948, Palestinians were made into refugees and had to leave their homes. As a refugee, have the right to return. And the remaining core question for Palestinians is, when are they going to see their right of return fulfilled? Every refugee has the right to return. Every Palestinian has the right to return to their home. What will that look like? We need to figure that out. It's not just as easy as saying, go back to your home, but it is a process, but it is a process of justice and restitution. But that question, before we talk one-state solution, two-state solution, who's going to govern Gaza, all of that is political dressing around a core human rights issue, which is how and when will Palestinians get their right to return to their home? What's the remedy for starvation and genocide is a question I don't think enough people ask, and I don't think we have good answers to. And I don't think we should focus only on the last 18 months. I think if we're going to ask the question of remedy and restitution and justice, we have to frame it in the long-term 75-year occupation by Israel of Palestinian territory. There's no way around that. So these 18 months were one of the most vicious, brutal, deadly moments in Palestinian history. But it's in part of a longer, slower process of pain and displacement. So I think we have to keep bringing back the issue of justice and restitution in that longer history. Otherwise, it'll be too narrow. What I do know is that the impact of the last 15 months on the people of Gaza is going to be felt for generations. So the harder question for humanitarian and human rights organizations is, what will it take to make sure that the Palestinians in Gaza can live with dignity? How much will it cost, and who's going to pay? Israel must pay. The United States must pay, and Germany must pay real money to ensure, not to reconstruct Gaza, but to ensure every Palestinian in Gaza lives with dignity, to be better off than they were before October 2023, to be better off than they were in 2000, to be better off than they were in 1991. That's what international law requires, and that's what's due to the Palestinian people. We've seen a people record their own genocide with no adequate international response. We've seen people mobilize around the world for Palestinian solidarity in ways we haven't seen for generations. We've seen every social movement that has an international dimension rise up to support the Palestinian people. We've seen students in North America and around the world put their education and their civil liberty at stake to support Palestinian human rights. We've seen people marching, calling for a free Palestine. We've never heard that in North America in recent times. I never thought people would demand a free Palestine. So just as we're in a moment of profound horror, we're also in a moment of profound uprising and support for Palestinian solidarity. And I often get asked, why are you focusing on Palestine in light of all the other atrocities and other issues of starvation around the world? The reason is because I've never seen millions of people mobilize around a human rights cause like this. And the reason is people around the world see their own oppression, their own exploitation, their own injustice in the Palestinian cause. Every injustice in the world you can imagine is happening against the Palestinians at an extreme form, in the most violent form. So people recognize their own struggle in the Palestinian struggle, which is why people mobilized so quickly to support the Palestinians and their fight for self-determination. South Africa brought a case before the International Court of Justice at the end of December 2023, claiming that Israel was committing genocide against the Palestinian people in Gaza. And when South Africa made its oral arguments in the International Court of Justice, the whole world was watching. This is very rare. Most people don't watch the proceedings of the International Court of Justice. But when South Africa stood up and made its arguments, and made the types of arguments it did, based on historical narratives, on the creation of Israel, on framing the issue as a matter of settler colonialism and apartheid, South Africa was speaking for the entire world. That was the legal argument it made before the International Court of Justice. Now, the court has since provided provisional measures saying basically there is a risk of genocide, and it identified the fact that there is starvation and famine going on in Gaza, and that Israel had a duty to stop denying humanitarian aid and targeting civilians. The court did put out these provisional measures. Israel ignored the court and actually escalated the violence every time the court made a pronouncement. Moreover, Israel is attacking the entire UN system. They've named the Secretary General as persona non grata, meaning they refuse to recognize the Secretary General and won't allow him into Israel. They've actually shot at UN peacekeepers in southern Lebanon. So they've attacked UN peacekeepers with bullets. And Israel has thumbed its nose at international law. I've heard ambassadors say that when Israel attacks the UN, it's attacking the world. So we see these court proceedings are happening. It'll be years before the International Court of Justice finally confirms that this is genocide, and it'll be too late by then. We know it's genocide. The court has given us what we need to understand what's going on. South Africa has made very strong pleadings, and its oral arguments gave the world hope. The question now isn't, I think, a legal one anymore. I think the legal question has been clear. However you define it, crime against humanity, war crime, genocide, what have you. Israel has committed an atrocity and is denying the Palestinian people's right to return to their home. And the question is now a political one. How can we change and mobilize and organize in a way to hold all governments accountable? Because if we allow Israel to do what it's doing, nothing's going to stop another government from using starvation against other people. Nothing's going to stop another government from using genocide against the people. For every atrocity we allow, we're going to enable yet another one. So we've seen the rise of starvation being used as a weapon of war, starvation being used against civilians. With what Israel did in Gaza, if it's allowed to happen and if governments don't respond, what I've told governments in the UN is, you're next. If you don't stop Israel, nothing's going to stop another country from starving you. Israel is guilty of genocide, and the United States is complicit, and Germany is complicit, and all of the countries that have provided Israel with money and weapons over the last 15 months at least are all complicit in genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, human rights violations. The list goes on and on.